here with B cells, right? Remember, antigen recognition is needed. Which will lead to the formation of plasma memory cells. Remember, plasma cells are the ones that are producing antibodies. All right, that activation process also requires help from T cells, all right, which we'll get into that a little bit more too. And remember, the B cell receptor can bind free-floating antigen, right, which is a unique feature that it has that a T cell receptor does not have. Okay. So one of the things that's really interesting about the immune system, and actually the same basic principle applies to T cell receptors, is by design, they can recognize almost a limitless number of pathogen epitopes. All right? And the reason that this is possible, right, is because they have something called variable regions, and you'll see what that looks like in just a second, right, in the genes that lead to the formation of these B cell receptors. And the same basic principle is going to apply to the formation of antibodies, all right? And so something called a RAG enzyme, right, is able to make different combinations of the final gene product, right, by taking different blocks from these variable regions and putting them together in different combinations, okay? All right, so RAG enzyme. Okay. So don't worry, because this next page is just kind of showing you some of this stuff. And so this is more of a diagram. So what you see here, right, is you can see these different variable regions, right, that are going to eventually lead to the formation of an antibody. So you have, right, V regions, D regions, and J regions. And here you can see, right, so this is V1 through 65, right? Here you have 27, right, D possibilities, and here you have 6 J possibilities. So these are the different segments of genes that when you put them together, you get the B cell receptor, or, right, you can get antibodies, and T cell receptors follow a very similar basic level of organization. And so what can happen, right, is the RAG enzyme can come in and it starts randomly combining some of these different segments together, all right? And so it gives you a wide variety of combinations, and this wide variety of combinations is why, right, your body is able to respond to new pathogens even if it's never seen it before, all right? So you basically are putting things together in all sorts of combinations in anticipation of maybe one day seeing, right, a pathogen that triggers, right, or responds to that antibody or that B cell or T cell receptor, okay? So if some of you remember, if you've ever taken ANP1, we briefly talked about, or you probably did briefly talk about, I don't think I had any of you in ANP1. Maybe, Abby, did I have you in ANP? Okay, so I just had Abby in ANP1. But one of the things, right, if you look at the amino acid, right, amino acids, and there's, how many amino acids are there? Like, oh, good, okay, good, 20, that's right. Right, and the way you can kind of treat amino acids is like letters of the alphabet, right? How many letters in the alphabet are there? Huh? 26, 26. Okay, a new alphabet, the language is evolving, right? So I can go with that, all right? But 26, right? And with those 26 letters or with those 20 amino acids, right, you have almost a limitless combination of ways you can arrange things and put them together. And it's a very similar process here, right? So when you're born, right, you have all these different regions that can be combined in different ways to potentially protect you from unique pathogens. So that's kind of how that works. So this is general form of an antibody, right? You've probably seen this before, maybe. It looks like a Y, right? And there are a couple major regions that we care about, the Fab region and the FC region. If you kind of jump over here to this image on the right, you'll see that the variable region, right, is the top part of the Y, and the constant region is the bottom part of the Y. And both of these are very important areas. The variable region, right, based on what we were just talking about, you could probably guess, and it's written right here, this is where antigens are bound. Now notice, right, with an antibody, you combine 2, right, of the same antigen. So these branches of the Y, or these arms of the antibody, right, are recognizing the same epitope. And you'll see in just a second why that is actually an important feature, right? This constant region, right, also called the FC region, is really important because some macrophages have something called an FC receptor. And that means that a macrophage, right, can look for this region of an antibody that is theoretically bound to some type of pathogen, right? And it helps it, right, phagocytize whatever that antibody is bound to. So both of these areas of the antibodies are really important. And you'll see in just a second, there are different classes of antibodies, right? And again, those different classes of antibodies are going to have slight variations typically in their FC regions. All right, but that's basic antibody structure. It looks like a Y, right? Top part of the Y is the variable region. That's what's recognizing the epitope, right? The specific region of an antigen on a pathogen. And the FC region is going to be really important because phagocytes often have receptors that can interact with those. All right. This is an important concept in a really simple diagram from the textbook that I used to use, but I do really like it. And first of all, right, it shows, right, an epitope, a specific binding region. So here, right, it's saying you have your sphere or circle epitope, you have a cube epitope, and you kind of have a cone epitope. All right. And the reason I like this illustration is because it is showing that all these epitopes exist on the same bacterial cell, right? And so you can have multiple antibodies that are responding to different regions of the same pathogen. All right. So it would not be an accurate statement if we just said, oh, there was one antibody that's produced when we respond to a Streptococcus pyogenes infection. All right. Why is this beneficial? Why is this a good thing that you have multiple antibodies recognizing different epitopes on the same pathogen? It's okay, it's Monday. Ooh. I kind of like where you're starting to go. You're hinting at where I want to go, but you're not quite there. You're on the right path. I like it. Jennifer Buckner?
Does it allow more chance that there's going to be an antibody that's got the right?
Right, yes, and so it's essentially more chance, right? And so kind of what Alanis was saying, different regions, right? More chance. And so one of the things that we'll kind of talk about a little bit, and this probably is not shocking to you, but pathogens change sometimes on accident through a mutation that's beneficial to them, but sometimes they actually have, right, segments of their genome that purposefully allows them to make changes that change, right, some of these epitopes. And so if you have antibodies that recognize multiple epitopes, you increase your chances of finding that pathogen. You also increase your chances of interacting with that pathogen. Maybe for some reason it downregulates the cube or square epitope, but then you still have two other epitopes that it can go after, right? And so your body, right, has multiple points of attack, which is really good for trying to eliminate a pathogen. All right. So depending on what textbook or what source you're looking at, some of these may get grouped together. For me, I say that antibodies do 6 different things, all right? Or clear or interact with pathogens in 6 different ways, all right? So one way here is opsonization. And so you can see opsonization, right? That phagocyte is interacting with the FC region of an antibody, right? That constant region of the antibody, and it's helping it phagocytize that bacteria. Right? We also talked about last week complement system activation. Does anyone remember what there's 3 complement pathways. Which one requires antibodies? Classic, right? The OG, perfect, right? And so you need those antibodies in order to activate the classic complement pathway, right? Which again can then lead to opsonization, right? It can lead to the formation of that membrane attack complex, so lysis of foreign cells, and the inflammatory response, right? It can cause vasodilation and also attract cells of the innate immune system, right? Immobilization and prevention of adherence. We haven't really talked about this too much yet, but one of the major ways that bacteria get around within your body is they have something called flagella, right? And if you've taken a cell bio course before, maybe you've talked about these briefly, right? But it kind of looks like a tail, right? That can spin around and propel that pathogen through the system. And so, you know, again, if we'll go with Caitlin because she's back, right? If she was robbing a bank, right? A good way to stop her would be to take the tires off of her getaway car, right? And then she'd be stuck. Same idea with the pathogen, right? Or if you've ever had a parking ticket and you've gotten a boot, right? Has anyone in here ever gotten a boot on their car? No? No one? Okay, good. Me either, but, right, maybe our time will come, right? But again, you can't move. Bacteria also have things on them called fimbriae or pili, all right? And these are basically look like hair-like projections that allow them to stick to things, right? And that's how some pathogens interact with your cells. Those fimbriae or those pili will attach to the cell. And so again, if you block those, then, right, there's no interaction. So you're preventing an interaction between that pathogen and the host, specifically in this case, looking more at bacteria, all right? Cross-linking, so this is important concept because I mentioned before when each of those arms, right, of that antibody, right, those 2 variable region attachment points can bind to multiple pathogens. And so what happens here is you cross-link, or you basically form a clump or a cluster of pathogens. And this is much more efficient for the innate immune system, typically, specifically, to come in and then phagocytize, right, all of those pathogens. If you're having to Pac-Man it, right, and go one at a time, right, it takes a lot longer. It's also possible that bacteria, if we're talking about bacteria, could even have divided by the time you get to all of them. And so this way you kind of group them together, all right? If any of you have younger siblings, right, it's much easier to clean up all of their toys if for some reason they pile them in the center of the room, which they never do, right, as opposed to having them scattered throughout the whole room, right? So you're clustering pathogens together so it's more efficient to remove them. One of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later, but not too much, right, is you actually have an adaptive immune cell called a natural killer cell. And what these cells do, or one of the things they do, is they look for self cells that may be coded in antibodies, all right? If a self cell is coded in antibodies, right, that means that something is wrong. That is not a normal situation. And so a natural killer cell will recognize that that cell is sick or injured, right, and will deliver, right, kind of like a cytotoxic T cell, a kill package that will induce apoptosis and kill that cell. Okay. Those of you that are, you know, I know, Sarah, you're interested in environmental science stuff, right? Some? Who else? Is anyone environmental science related in here? Yeah, Savannah, a little bit? Okay, good. So we'll pick on Savannah. Savannah, if you saw a raccoon just strolling down the street in the middle of the day, would you be concerned? Savannah, for the sake of this example, would you be concerned? Yes, right? Who knows anything about raccoons? Like, what's their basic behavior? They're nocturnal, right? They hang out at night. And so if a raccoon's just kind of chilling, walking around during the day, just out in the open, not really caring if there are people or cars driving by, right, then there's probably something wrong with that raccoon, right? Or if you saw a bat flying around during the day, like in the afternoon, that would be strange, all right? And so natural killer cells are looking for those strange kind of abnormal situations that maybe wouldn't trigger the adaptive or their innate immune system, right? So they're great at kind of cleaning up or noticing things that could get missed, all right? Neutralization, all right, is where you have antibodies that surround, right? Again, you have multiple touch points. Here, so it's antibodies can surround a virus, right? So it's a little different than immobilization, because although viruses can kind of float around, viruses don't have flagella, they don't have fimbriae, although they do have something kind of close to fimbriae that we'll talk about next unit. But viruses aren't swimming around, right? So if I put them in a tube or a tub of liquid on one side, right, a virus couldn't swim across to the other, right? It would kind of just rely on the current of the system. Whereas a bacteria, right, with a flagella could actually propel itself across, right? So that's why we consider this a little different than immobilization, but it's the same basic concept. If you've surrounded that virus with antibodies, it can't interact with its target cell, right? Same premise for toxins, right? So one of the most common bacterial infections that you've probably all been immunized for that is toxin-based, right, is tetanus, right? So tetanus is produced by the bacteria that causes tetanus is Clostridium tetani, right? And it actually produces toxins that interfere with neuron function, all right? And so the vaccine that you get is actually more for the toxin, and so it neutralizes the toxin. And then once the toxin's neutralized, your body's actually usually able to deal with the infection with not too much help, all right? So 6 ways. There might be a question. Caitlin, can you see this? Yeah. Okay, good. You're far away. I just want to make sure. Jennifer Buckner? Okay, good. About some of this on the exam. Holmes? All right, good. Very, very briefly, right, I just want to mention some of the different classes of antibodies. IgM, right, is the first antibody that's produced in response to a pathogen, all right? So every time you first encounter a pathogen, right, IgM is the first antibody that's produced. And then, right, your body, right, with those RAG enzymes will actually go through different antigen or different antibody combinations to find some other antibodies that are good at binding to that pathogen. What's really cool about IgM is it can form something called a pentamer. And I'll actually show you a picture of this a little bit later. It basically looks like a little ninja star. And the way these antibodies bind together is it actually gives it 10 attachment points. So it's really good at interacting with pathogens. You also have IgG. So if for some reason you're ever thinking about antibodies, which I do sometimes, I don't know if you do, but this is probably the one that you're typically thinking of. This is the majority of your antibodies that are in circulation. So when we talk about the positive effects of a vaccine, right, or the positive effects of natural immunity, it's usually going to be a robust IgG response that is going to help you clear that pathogen. You can see on this diagram, it has the longest half-life, and so it can remain in circulation longer than your other antibodies. And again, this is something that's beneficial if you're talking about it being a protective mechanism as part of immunity. And those of you that were born, which appears to be all of you, and those of you that may choose to one day have a child, which will only be some of you, sorry, gents, right? But IgG is the only antibody that actually crosses the placenta. And so that baby, right, as he or she is growing inside mom, right, is receiving immune protection via IgG from mom until they can start to produce their own IgG and until their immune system kind of kicks into gear, all right? And you'll see that here in just a second. IgA is one of my favorite antibodies because it is the antibody that is found primarily in poop. You guys poop out grams of IgG every day. And if you were to look at the size of an individual antibody, you would realize that that's a lot of IgG that you're pooping out, right? And oftentimes that IgG that you're pooping out has bacteria bound to it, right? And so not IgG, IgA, sorry. So IgA, right, is produced in your mucosal surfaces. So your GI tract, your respiratory tract, and your urogenital tract are producing high levels of IgA. All right.
Is that what's found in like breast milk too?
So IgA is found in breast milk. Yeah. So IgG, right, travels from mom to baby via the umbilical cord and then enters. IgA is what's going through breast milk. And again, going back to some of the papers from last week, we were talking about microbiome stuff. The IgA that a mother gives to a baby via breast milk is really important for helping that baby stay healthy and fight off any type of maybe infection. But it also helps shape the gut bacteria that live in that baby, right? Because it can interact and remove the harmful ones, and it actually gives a baby healthy microbiome, which we would argue later down the road, right, leads to a better overall health outcome for said child. All right. So yes, so rarely in circulation, right? And typically what you actually see with IgA is two of the FC regions, or the FC regions of two antibodies will come attached. And so then it's basically like two Ys that are kind of facing out from one another. They link together, all right? IgE, all right, is really important for inflammation. What we see though, and where we most commonly encounter it, is it will actually interact with receptors on the surface of mast cells and basophils. And when it recognizes an antigen, it causes something called cross-linking. So it pulls two antibodies together. And when those two antibodies come together, it releases histamine, all right, a lot of times. And so if you have allergies, right, and sometimes even severe allergies, it's actually an IgE response that is causing a lot of that discomfort or maybe even life-threatening anaphylactic shock. All right. The one that I didn't include on here is something called IgD. IgD so far, and I could be wrong because I'll be honest, right? I haven't done a lit search in a while, but IgD is expressed on the surface of mature B cells. So that's how we know a B cell is ready to do its job, is there's IgD on its surface. But as far as interacting with pathogens or having a direct effect on the immune response, we don't have anything to link it to that yet. Maybe it does. All right. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so typically, okay, so I'm not going to say never because there are some cases where it doesn't link, but it's more of a clean out the system kind of antibody, right? So if we're talking about, when I'm talking about when you go poop, right? You have IgA that's bound to a pathogen, so it kind of gets brushed out of the system. If we're talking about in your lungs, like mucosal surface in your lungs, right? It's going to bind to pathogens that are stuck in there. And then when you cough, right, or you expel mucus, there's pathogens that are trapped by the IgA in there. So you're correct. Its main purpose is not going to be to attract a phagocyte. Its main purpose is to essentially immobilize or bind. And then your body has ways, right, either through defecation or through moving mucus up that it's going to get it out of the body. So it's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
So you said the IgDs, we didn't really see them in
Uh-huh.
So is it defined as an antibody structure?
Yeah, so it's going to be, so IgD primarily is just going to exist as a B cell receptor. And so it has that, I mean, it has the antibody shape, it has variable regions, it has a constant region. We just have no idea what it's actually doing other than saying, hey, I'm a mature B cell, I'm ready to, do something. And then when that same B cell that has IgD on its surface actually starts doing something, again, it's going to depend where the B cell is, but it's going to be doing something via one of these other antibodies. So then the IgD becomes just a marker, not actually part of the pathogen treatment kind of effect. All right. And if any of you have ever had severe allergies or known someone with severe allergies that goes in and gets like shots, and sometimes you'll do this for years. Has anyone ever done that or know someone that's done that? Do you do that? Yeah, no, you don't. Do you know why you don't? Say thank you, IgG. So what happens in some cases, right, people that have bad allergies is they go in and they get kind of small doses of that antigen spread out over time. And basically what you start to do is you start to build up the amount of IgG that's circulating in your system to that antigen that would cause an allergic response. And so upon exposure now, so if I were to dump whatever that antigen is all over Morgan, right, she wouldn't react because the IgG would actually end up binding all of that antigen before IgE could interact with it, right? So those kind of allergy treatments are actually kind of tricking or using the immune system to sop up all of the antigen before IgE can interact with it. So it's kind of it's a cool immunologic concept that can be really beneficial to patients. And so this is just showing you some of the different ways, all right, or the different formations, right? So here's that pentamer, right? So again, I kind of have like the little ninja star. And you can see though, that's kind of cool because it gives it a lot of different attachment points in the variable regions for interacting with pathogens, right? Here you see IgG. Here's IgA, right, as a monomer. So it theoretically could maybe interact with phagocyte. But here, right, is that dimer that forms when you link the FC region of two of those antibodies. And then here you have IgE and IgD. And again, this is kind of a nice little table that kind of summarizes some of the unique features. And as I was just talking with Jada, right here you can see right, serum or secreted, except with the exception of IgD, right, which is going to remain on the B cell surface. And again, like I said, other than that, we really don't know what it's doing. All right. And here you can also see half-life. Again, IgG having the longest half-life of the bunch. Okay. So kind of a good summary to give you, kind of put those side by side and say, here, what are some of the differences and similarities? All right. This is just a diagram that I love because yes, ma'am. Ooh, I haven't looked at what's in formula. I would say, I'd have to go and check. I would say no, but again, I haven't checked formula. One of the things they do in formula is they put something in there called prebiotics. And prebiotics is basically bacteria food that encourages good growth of the bacteria that you want in your gut. As far as IgA, I haven't looked to see if they do that in formula. I do know for parents, well, moms specifically that can't breastfeed, or for moms that have adopted, there actually are organizations that collect breast milk from nursing mothers that have extra, and you can actually buy that, and then that would have the IgA in it to give to your infant. But that is considerably more pricey than even formula, but it definitely is an option. But as far as I know, no, they're not putting, but I can double check. That's a great question. It would be good if they could, but I'm not sure if they can. So I'll look into that. So this is just a diagram that's showing what's going on between a mom, right, and a growing baby in utero. And you can see that you have this kind of IgG that, right, continues to peak. Oh, in case you didn't know, right, there's a little arrow here because babies are born right around 9 months. If you didn't know that, right, take A&P2, and we'll talk about that there. All right. But basically what you can see here, right, is that the total IgG in the system, right, continues to rise as the baby approaches, right, his or her grand entry into the world. And at 9-ish months, right, a little after, you start to see the separation here, all right, and maternal IgG that it was getting from mom starts to gradually decline, right? And that's because there's no longer this link between mom and child, all right? Well, I want to say no longer this link. There's a different link, right, between mom and child. But it's nice because maternal IgG, right, IgG has a long half-life that even after that baby's born, right, that IgG that mom gave said baby, right, gives the baby time to start making its own IgG, right? And so there's kind of like a little bit of a trade-off or a point where those kind of cross over, and maternal IgG, right, starts to disappear from the system, but by that time, the baby's immune system is able to start to handle the load itself. Okay. Sorry? Yes, the baby can, yes. As soon as the baby can start producing IgG, it could theoretically produce the other type of antibodies. But again, and I'd have to find a chart that looks at like IgA expression, because nursing, right, is going to be the baby's main. So I'll actually, that kind of like, that's a really great question to kind of look side by side. But yes, theoretically, if it can be making IgG, it can be making the other antibodies. All right. Oh man, this is one of my also favorite charts, antibody related, right? So this is focusing on something called a primary and a secondary response. And so here, right, you see kind of the basis of the concept of immunization via vaccination, right, or immunization versus via a natural infection. And so what we see, right, is in the primary response, right, there's a couple things that I want you to note. First, right, is that the IgM response, right, is the first kind of response. So if you guys, right, remember from your papers, or if you read that paper about antibodies, the antibody test for COVID, right, and it could look at IgM and IgG. So how could I tell from that antibody test that someone was probably still in an active infection? Which one of these antibodies would be present in their system? IgM, right? You detect high levels of IgM because that's the first antibody that's being produced. And so in this case, an antibody test could, right, kind of help you determine active, right, versus an infection that has passed. All right. The rest of the adaptive immune system then eventually kicks in and you start producing IgG. You can see, though, that it is enough to deal with the pathogen, right? So this would be enough IgG, but it's not a very robust response. And, right, days, months, showing, right, especially if you got an illness for the first time, or, right, if you had, I know you've probably had multiple colds, maybe you've had influenza multiple times, right? Those viruses are changing and mutating. So every time, right, you get a cold, right, you're doing this kind of response. And so that's why you're sick for a prolonged period of time. It takes a while to build up a response that can handle that pathogen. However, right, if that same infection, right, or that same pathogen were to come back, your secondary response, here you can see, yes, IgM is still produced, but because you have something called immunologic memory now, because you've seen that pathogen, and again, we'll talk about how that forms in just a second, you have a very robust IgG response. And that very robust IgG response allows quick removal of the pathogen. Again, sometimes you won't even feel sick. You won't even know that it happened. Or if you do feel sick, it will be a very, very mild version of the infection. Yes, ma'am.
So when I was living, I got strep throat all the time.
Uh-huh.
So why did I still have it all the time when I should have the antibodies?
Right, and again, it's not a, yes, I mean, that's a great question, right? It's not a perfect system. Again, I mentioned bacteria change to that not being a case. But I have to go look up strep specifically. Gut would tell me that because it can change its antigens, or we'll see here that some pathogens are great at evading the immune system, right? That could be why the infection keeps on occurring. But that's actually a good point too. I'll look into see if there's something unique about the strep pathogen, because I know you are not the only child that, so I had, right, like some kids are just super prone to it. I had ear infections all the time, right? And so presumably you think the same basic concept, right? Because it's not like there's a ton of different bacteria that are doing that. So yeah, I'll look into that. I would assume antigenic variation can kind of change it itself, but I can look. All right, we're not going to watch this video because I can't get the sound to play. And we already know these two categories anyway. So let's briefly start to talk about specificity through education. And so this is a really important concept because this is where I'm going to give you guys just a little bit of a taste, not a big taste, but a little bit of a taste as to why your immune system should hopefully, for most of you, be really good at going after a pathogen and then really good at leaving your own cells alone. Okay. So B cells and T cells, again, how do they know what they're doing? And for B cells, we have something called negative selection. Okay? What's really cool about the immune system is that it tests itself. And so what we do here, right, is essentially we take a B cell, right, and by we, I mean your body, right, takes B cells that are hanging out in your bone marrow, and it tests them with self-antigen. Okay? And if a B cell responds to that self-antigen, all right, it becomes anergic and apoptosis is induced in that cell. So you remove it from the system. Okay. T cells have a similar process, but they have something called positive and negative selection. If you remember, which I know you all do, right, Hannah? You don't even know what I'm going to say. You can't commit to that, right? Hopefully you remember that a T cell receptor, right, has to have antigen presented to it, right, via another receptor. And that other receptor that's presenting antigen, we haven't gone over this yet, is something called an MHC receptor. And so that T cell receptor has to be able to interact with the MHC receptor. Without that interaction, it doesn't it's pathogenic. It doesn't matter if it's a host antigen, a good antigen. If those receptors can't interact, then we don't have a functional cell, right? So that's the first test. Can, right, a T cell receptor interact with an MHC receptor? And so we call that positive because you actually want those to link. Again, if they don't link, if that T cell receptor can't recognize that MHC receptor, then that's a problem, right? Because T cells can't bind free-floating antigen. So if they can't recognize the receptor that's presenting the antigen to them, we want them out of the system, right? We get rid of them. We then, like the B cell receptor, right, go into, right, this idea of negative selection. Okay, good. You can recognize the MHC receptor. Now, can you distinguish, right, a host antigen, right, from a pathogenic antigen? And if you interact with that host antigen that I present to you, that means that you're not good at doing your job. So I, right, remove you from the system. And just like the B cells, right, failure at either one of these levels results in an anergic cell where we induce apoptosis. Now, all right, Blair had started to talk about this last week. When we fail at these steps, all right, this is one of the reasons that we have autoimmune diseases. All right, so it is not a perfect system. Some people, right, no, I shouldn't say some people, some cells get through, right, this system of checks. Again, we could probably go and dig through the literature, and people have come up with a whole slew of reasons, but the thing is, right, it's not perfect, right? And we can you know, look to education as an example, right? Some people graduate high school, some people graduate college, and afterwards you're like, how did they do it? How did they get through? I don't know, right? But sometimes they do. just like T cells and B cells. Now I know that's none of you in here, right? Good. None of you in here, right? You're gonna crush it. I knew it, Holmes. All right, good, right? So again, sometimes cells get through that still interact with self-antigens, right? And so here, this is just showing you, again, notice this is in the bone marrow. So the bone marrow is where B cells are tested. Does anyone know off the top of the head where T cells are tested? Yeah, the thymus, all right? And so T cells, right, are formed in the red bone marrow, right, just like B cells, but then they leave, right? They go away, right, for their education, right, while B cells kind of stay in-house. But here you can see, right, B cells, right, that have their B cell receptors on their surface, okay? And here, right, it's saying cells with autoantigens, right? And so what's really cool is that in your body, you basically have cells that produce different antigens that would be seen throughout the whole entire body. And they test these cells with these antigens. And so here you see, right, in this case, this unlucky fellow here, right, recognizes an autoantigen. So his receptor links with that antigen, and then we get rid of him or her, right, depending on the made-up sex or gender that you choose to attach to your cells when you talk about them, all right? Here, right, you see that this B cell receptor does not recognize autoantigens, and so now it, right, can enter circulation and be part of, right, the immune system. Another thing, and I'm not going to mention it, you know, here about cells leaking through, but sometimes, or what we know on B cells and T cells is they have specific receptors on their surface that draw them to different areas of the body, all right? And so basically they become isolated. In some cases, for certain autoimmune diseases, things like a severe injury can actually expose a B cell or T cell that's been isolated in a different part of the body to an antigen that they were never supposed to see in a normal, healthy situation. And that can end up triggering an autoimmune disease. What we also see is that some pathogens have antigens that are very similar to host antigens. And when your body fights that infection, it actually primes a bunch of cells that are responding to an antigen that looks very similar to one of your own antigens. And so then that patient could have a autoimmune disease. We actually see this with sometimes viral infections in elementary aged school children, where there'll be a virus that kind of runs through, and then a few months later, you have a bunch of kids with type 1 diabetes, right? Doesn't happen a lot, but it can occasionally happen. So where we'll pick up on Wednesday, because today's Monday, is we'll keep on talking about T cells here. All right, so we'll finish up the adaptive immune system. I'm hoping on Wednesday that'll be as far as we go for your exam. All right, so we'll kind of shift things a little bit. We'll start with vaccinations next week. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so we are going to have disease presentations, but the due date on that is a carryover from last semester, so they can ignore that. I'll go ahead and hide it so they don't see it or have to worry about it right now. Okay, cool. All right, the rest of you get out of here. Have a great Monday. Please start the week well. Please email me with questions.